Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Claire Seckler-Merkel, President of the Phoenix Committee on Foreign Relations and Senior Director of Arizona Programs at the McCain Institute at ASU. Thank you for joining us today on this important and timely program on Ukraine and NATO with the McCain Institute and Malikian Center at ASU as co-sponsors. At PCFR, we are dedicated to providing forums that explore critical foreign policy issues, building enduring international connections for Arizona, and we're committed to adding timely programs such as this one as world events unfold and as we face the uncertain situation with Ukraine and Russia. I can think of no one better to discuss the latest developments in historical and future ramifications of this issue than our guest today. For those of you who are not yet members of PCFR, we welcome you to join. We'd love to have you join our community of interested and interesting global thinkers. You can find a membership application online at pcfraz.org or reach out to any one of us. Continuing on our NATO theme, I'm happy to announce that next week, the McCain Institute and PCFR are partnering with the Atlantic Council on NATO in America. I will be moderating the opening conversation with Representative Ruben Gallego at the ASU Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law beginning at noon on February 22nd. The conference will continue all day with great sessions. It is free and open to the public, and we especially encourage students to attend. On March 3rd, please save the date for Consul General of Israel, Dr. Hillel Newman. On March 10th, we will welcome author Steve Miska, talking about Iraq in his new book. Vladimir Kramer, a Russian defender of democracy and two-time survivor of Russian poisoning, joins us in person on March 15th, continuing our Great Power Competition series. That program is also complimentary, thanks to our sponsors. These programs are up on our website and ready for registration. Next, I want to give a great thank you to our annual sponsors for making our continuing and ever-growing work possible. Our title sponsor, Freeport-McMoRan, our diamond sponsors, Arizona Commerce Authority in Santa Cruz County, our media sponsor, KJZZ, our platinum sponsors, ASU Sandra Day O'Connor Law School, the McCain Institute, Snell and Wilmer, W.R. Schultz Investments, and Thunderbird School of Global Management. Our gold and silver sponsors, Salt River Project, APS, South 32, Novele Community Activators, ASU Malikian Center, Spencer Fain, Wallace Pleas and Dreyer, Chicanas Por La Causa, Resolution Copper, the City of Peoria, and Visit Phoenix. We are delighted to welcome so many new sponsors in the last little bit. I would also like to thank our international visionary donor, Ellen Schultz, and lifetime benefactors, Keith Galbett, Charles Irion, Karen Meyer, JP Mion, Shoshana Tanser, and Melissa Sanderson. Before I introduce our speaker, a bit of housekeeping. Please do keep your computers and phones on mute, and please type your questions into the chat, and I will ask them on your behalf. I would also like to shout a great welcome to all of the students who are joining us from outside of Arizona today. We're glad to have you. It is now my great honor and pleasure to introduce David Kramer. He's a great friend and colleague for nearly 30 years and a bright, thoughtful commentator on Russia and Europe, a consistently tough critic of President Putin, a cogent and thoughtful writer, and a dedicated champion for human rights and democracy throughout his distinguished career. David serves as the managing director for global policy at the George Bush Institute. Prior to joining the Institute, he taught at Florida International University's School of International and Public Affairs, where he was also senior fellow in the Václav Havel Program for Human Rights and Diplomacy and director for European and Eurasian Affairs. Before moving to Miami, David worked in Washington, D.C. for 24 years, including as Senior Director for Human Rights and Democracy with the McCain Institute, President of Freedom House, and Senior Transatlantic Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. He also served 8 years in the U.S. Department of State during the George W. Bush administration, including as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, responsible for Russia, Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus, and a professional staff member in the Secretary's Office of Policy Planning and senior advisor to the Undersecretary of Global Affairs. He was also executive director of the U.S. Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy in Washington and is author of the book, Back to Containment, Dealing with Putin's Regime. It is my great pleasure to welcome David. We're delighted that you share your time with us today, and the floor is yours.
Well, Claire, thanks so much. It's great to see you, albeit virtually. And you're right, it is almost 30 years that we've been friends. That's a long time, but it's great to see you. And my thanks to your viewers who have joined as well. And I hope that after some opening comments, we can make this as interactive as possible with all of you. I'm really pleased to be here during this time, but it is a difficult time to comment on what's happening because it is an incredibly fluid situation. And in fact, some notes that I had jotted down a day or two ago in preparation for this are really kind of OBE, if you will. But I'll do my best to try to give you a sense of what's happening. We'll talk about the issue of NATO in Ukraine as well, but I think the most immediate issue is what's happening now between Russia and Ukraine and what the West and the international community can do. Let me start by explaining why this is important, why Americans should care. The European continent, as you know, was the scene last century of two awful world wars. And since then, since the end of World War II in 1945, Europe has more or less maintained stability and security, albeit parts of Europe were under Soviet communist domain. And since the end of the Cold War in 1991, we have seen an expansion of liberty and freedom in Europe, albeit with some backsliding, but we have also seen challenges as well. And what we see now is a potential threat to all of that, where Europe could face the most serious security crisis since the end of World War II if Russian leader Vladimir Putin decides to reinvade Ukraine. Why do I say reinvade? Because Mr. Putin has done it before. He did it in 2014 after the revolution of dignity in Ukraine that saw the pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych, flee from power and go to Russia. Russia had intervened. Mr. Putin had intervened a few months before, at the end of 2013, when Mr. Yanukovych was prepared to sign an agreement with the European Union, and Putin pressured him into not signing it. And that then triggered the revolution of dignity, where Ukrainians decided, no, we actually do want to sign the agreement with the EU. We want to get closer to Europe and to the West. And Russian intervention in that sparked a revolution that then led to the change in power in February of 2014. Putin responded by invading Crimea initially. It wasn't a violent invasion because the Ukrainians decided not to put up any resistance, but it led to the illegal annexation of Ukrainian territory in the Crimean Peninsula, and was then followed by a decision by Russian forces to invade in the Donbass region. To be clear, in neither area, neither Crimea nor Donbass, were there calls for separatism or for independence or to be annexed by Russia. There was a phony referendum that Russia oversaw in Crimea that no one recognized, that did vote for annexation by Russia. But again, no one recognized this referendum. And in Donbass, these were Russian forces. These were Russian figures who were leading an effort to try to stir up trouble in Ukraine. Why did Putin do this? He does not want to see Ukraine succeed. He fears a vibrant, successful democracy along Russia's borders that could pose a threatening alternative to the corrupt authoritarian system that he oversees in Russia. So he does not want Russians to get the idea, well, if Ukraine can move in this direction, if Ukraine can succeed, if it can demand an end to corruption and authoritarianism, why can't we? That poses a threat to Putin's grip on power. Ukraine, by the way, was not the first country Putin invaded. There was the invasion of Georgia in 2008 that was over in 5 days, but led to 20% of Georgian territory to this day being occupied by Russian forces. Of course, we saw the intervention in Syria in 2015, in which Mr. Putin intervened in that country to prop up the murderous regime of Bashar al-Assad. So Putin has a way of flexing his muscles in dangerous ways that put at risk not only his own people, but his neighbors as well, including in Ukraine and in Georgia. We've also seen Putin intervene in the situation in neighboring Belarus to keep Alexander Lukashenko, who had been dubbed as Europe's last dictator, in power, despite an effort by a popular movement to call for change there. Putin doesn't like to see change in the region as a result of popular movements. And so Putin is interested in preserving the status quo, particularly where it involves like-minded authoritarian leaders, so that Russia itself won't get any ideas that they could try the same inside Russia. If he were to reinvade on a major scale again, Putin would also be violating a number of treaties and charters and agreements, some of which go back even before the collapse of the Soviet Union, such as the Helsinki Accords, the Paris Charter of 1990, the adapted version of that in 1999, the Budapest Memorandum. Why is that important? That was signed by Ukraine and Russia, the UK, and the United States, in which Ukraine agreed to relinquish its nuclear weapons that it had inherited from the Soviet Union in exchange for promises and pledges that the other signatories would respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And so Putin threatens to rip up this entire international or European security architecture if he were to reinvade Ukraine once more. And we all know about the tremendous buildup of Russian military forces along the border. Estimates are between 150 and 170,000 forces in Crimea, the occupied part of Ukraine, along the border with Ukraine and the eastern part of Ukraine, but then also in Belarus, which is to the north of Ukraine, where Russia has been involved in military exercises since February 10th, and those will end on February 20th. That date is significant. I know the Biden administration had mentioned the real possibility of a major Russian move yesterday, and it didn't happen. But February 20th is when the military exercise ends with Belarus. It's also when the Olympics end in China. And so there is concern that after those exercises are over, that we could see a military move against Ukraine. As you know, Russian officials are arguing that they are withdrawing, they're pulling back, that they're willing to engage in diplomacy, but the United States, along with a number of European allies, have said that that in fact is not happening, that in fact we've seen an increase in Russian troop presence along the border, some 7,000 additional troops and other logistical and support facilities that would be important should an invasion be launched. So there are conflicting claims being made in Moscow and counterclaims in Washington, including earlier today at the UN by Secretary Blinken, and these will continue over the next days. It is an incredibly tense time. It has been made a little worse by the talk, which may not be unfounded, to be fair, by the US that an attack was imminent. The decision to evacuate the US embassy, and the Canadians also decided to evacuate their embassy from Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, and the move toward Lviv, which is in the western part of Ukraine, has also, I think, fed a rather bad impression in Ukraine, which I think Mr. Putin wanted to create, that in Ukraine's greatest time of need, that the United States and others were actually leaving, not staying. Most Ukrainians are staying where they are. Most Ukrainians have decided that they will stay and fight. And you look at the number of Ukrainians who are enlisting in the military or in special forces or in neighborhood militias, whatever the case may be. The situation in Ukraine today in 2022 is much different than it was in 2014. Under President Yanukovych, the pro-Russian president who fled in 2014, he badly weakened the Ukrainian military, and it was not in good shape when Russia first invaded. The Ukrainian military is vastly improved over what it was, still not a great match for the Russian military, which significantly outnumbers Ukraine's forces, but still Ukraine is in a much stronger position to fight back, to defend itself, and then even if necessary, to resist a Russian invasion and occupation should it occur. And so one of the factors that Mr. Putin has to think about is the number of body bags that would be going back to Russia and the reaction of Russians to that possibility. He also has to think about sanctions that the West has talked about should he move forward. The United States, together with our allies in Europe and elsewhere, have put together a significant package of sanctions that would impose serious consequences on the Russian government and sectors in Russia's finance and energy areas, as well as export controls, so no semiconductors or dual technology that could be exported. It would include ending the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which would, if ever certified, would run from Russia directly to Germany with natural gas deliveries. And there would be other steps and measures taken as well that would try to impose massive consequences on Russia should Putin decide to invade. So he has to be thinking about those consequences as well. In the Congress, there has been legislation that's been pending. It now seems stuck. The Republicans and Democrats don't seem able to agree on a package of sanctions measures. But frankly, the president of the United States already has the authority to do most of the things that Congress is calling for. But among the things that the Senate has urged, again, not through legislation because it can't get agreement, but among the things they've urged is to actually sanction Mr. Putin himself and the circle around him. And I actually think that is one of the most effective tools that we could use, which would be to deny Mr. Putin the ability to be among polite company, if you will. He has, in my view, no business being among polite company. And it also would mean that the possibility of his assets, to the extent that we can track them down, and the assets of the circle around him, the close circle around him, would be frozen, so that neither he nor they could stash their ill-gotten gains in the West. They couldn't send their families to vacation. They couldn't buy property in the West. They wouldn't be able to send their children to study in the West. And I think those sanctions are arguably among the ones that would get the most attention from Mr. Putin and ones that he has to take seriously. I do think that the approach of the United States in the past few weeks has been better than initially. Although I think it's important to go back to the beginning of the Biden administration, which came into office with a fairly tough line toward the Putin regime, where it imposed 2 rounds of sanctions, one of which was in response to the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition figure, and then for additional violations that Russia has committed. President Biden famously, in response to a question by George Stephanopoulos, said that yes, he did think Putin was a killer when asked. And then Putin started building up his military presence along the border with Ukraine in April of last year. And instead of sticking to a harder line that I would have preferred to have seen, the White House decided to try to de-escalate the situation by extending an offer to Putin for a summit in Geneva. That then was followed the next month in May by a White House decision to waive sanctions on this Nord Stream 2 pipeline that I mentioned. The reason it's called Nord Stream 2 is because there's a Nord Stream 1 that already sends Russian gas directly from Russia to Germany. Nord Stream 2 is particularly controversial because most Europeans oppose it, but it would also obviate the need for a pipeline that currently runs from Russia through Ukraine to other parts of Europe, for which Ukraine is dependent to the tune of $2 to $3 billion in transit fees. Moreover, Ukrainians think that as long as Russia does not have Nord Stream 2 as an option, they have an interest in keeping the pipeline running through Ukraine viable and open, and therefore that provides some additional security against a potential Russian invasion. So Nord Stream 2 is an issue that has certainly come up a lot, but the administration last May decided to waive sanctions that could have put a halt to the pipeline. And that was done in part because of its interest in improving relations with Germany, which had been in pretty bad shape from the previous administration. Then we saw, after the June summit between Biden and Putin in Geneva, we saw the United States and Russia engage in a number of high-level talks and negotiations in the realm of what's called strategic stability, which mostly means arms control, but also efforts to deconflict so that there are not accidents between our two militaries. Just the other day, by the way, speaking of accidents, there almost were accidents when Russian and American planes came perilously close, apparently just feet from each other, flying over the ocean. So there is a great need to try to deconflict so that we know where Russian planes and ships are going, and they know where our planes and ships are going, so that we don't have an accident that could lead to a massive escalation. But those talks then coincided with, again, another military buildup by Putin along the border starting in late October and November. And it was this latest buildup that was more open and public and much larger than it was before last spring that has gotten the attention. And we have seen some video calls and phone calls between President Biden and President Putin. Those have not seemed to have made much headway in trying to lower the tensions. But you've also seen a number of European leaders travel to Moscow to try to engage in diplomacy. President Macron was there last week and thought he had come away with a pledge from Putin to try to de-escalate the situation and focus on diplomacy. Instead, Russian officials gave him the back of their hand and said they had made no such pledges. Then earlier this week, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz was in Moscow, and he had visited Kiev right before. He was in Moscow and again, trying to stress the importance of diplomacy. And there was some indication that Putin might be willing to go down that path. But at the same time, we see the continued Russian military buildup. So it's not clear that any of these visits by Western leaders have made much in the way of traction. So it is a very perilous situation. And the administration continues to talk about a diplomacy track. It continues to talk about a deterrence track. And it's not quite clear where we are going to go. This may unfold very quickly. It may unfold despite the administration's efforts to provide as much warning as possible. I do think the Biden administration deserves credit for releasing on a steady basis, excuse me, intelligence that indicates all sorts of machinations on the part of the Kremlin with false flag operations. We've just seen today, for example, the Russian government has claimed that the Ukrainian side shelled an elementary school or nurseries in the Russian occupied part of the Donbass. The Ukrainians have denied this, but the Russians may be looking for a pretext. President Putin has referred on a number of occasions that the Ukrainians are committing genocide against ethnic Russians in Ukraine. Again, a line that we have seen before from Putin that has been the precursor to a military operation. We also heard either yesterday or today, Russian claims that they have found mass graves of ethnic Russians that have been murdered by the Ukrainians. The rhetoric, on the one hand, the Russian side talks about diplomacy and that they are de-escalating, but the other rhetoric certainly points to a heightening of tensions. And the Russians seem to be trying to provoke the Ukrainian side into doing something. We have to keep in mind that there are gradations between a de-escalation and a massive invasion. And this is where I think things will get tricky for the West. If Putin decides not to order a major attack against Ukraine, he may still go ahead and do a number of other things that would test not only Ukraine, but would test the rest of the international community. We already have seen several cyber attacks, including a cyber attack on the Ukrainian Defense Ministry and two major banks that were dealt with, but there had been a major cyber attack just a few weeks ago as well. We could see, I hesitate to use this term because President Biden got into some trouble for talking about minor incursions, but we could see an incursion by the Russian side into the Donbass region, possibly a quick in and out movement so that they are not there on a regular basis. We could see Russia try to disable or blow up the pipeline that they currently use for Russian gas flowing through Ukraine in order to pressure the Germans to certify the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. The Russians have already decreased the flow of supplies to Europe for natural gas, naturally right in the middle of winter. And we could see any other number of scenarios. The Russian parliament yesterday passed legislation calling for recognition as independent states, the Donetsk and Luhansk regions that are occupied by Russian forces. It's not clear to me that President Putin will sign that legislation, because if he does, it'll mean the end of the Minsk II process. That's a process that was launched in February 2015 with France and Germany as parties to that agreement with Russia and Ukraine that is supposed to deal with the crisis. There has been precious little movement on it, and the Russians are supposed to withdraw under the Minsk II agreement, their forces from the Donbass region, and they have not done that at all. They are trying to pressure the Ukrainians for the obligations they claim the Minsk II agreement imposes on Ukraine, which would include granting significant autonomy to the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. And that would give, in their hope, in the Moscow's hope, a veto over any Ukrainian aspirations for joining NATO in the European Union. And so we see if Putin were to sign this legislation, he would end the Minsk II process. And Russians so far at least seem to like to use the Minsk II process against Ukraine as a point of leverage. So I think there's a possibility Putin will try to play the role of the good guy, of the moderate, by saying, no, I'm not going to pass this legislation. This would only, or sign this legislation, this would only inflame the situation. And so it's possible that that legislation will just sit there for a while. But all of these scenarios that are short of a full-scale invasion will pose a real test to the West, because I think there is agreement among the United States and our European allies for a serious package of sanctions if Russia were to move militarily into Ukraine in a serious way. I think there will likely be disagreements and even debate between the United States and Europe should Putin do measures well short of a full invasion. Just today, the term again has been used of military technical measures that Russia may be forced to take as a result of what they claim are Ukrainian provocations during this conflict. So this is something I think to keep an eye on. There are variations on what Putin can do short of either de-escalating or a full-scale invasion that we really need to keep an eye on. About Ukraine, as I mentioned, Ukraine had a revolution in 2014 that I think was inspiring to many Ukrainians. They also had a revolution a decade before called the Orange Revolution, in which the same leader, Viktor Yanukovych, the pro-Russian president who fled to Russia in 2014, he was prime minister running for president in 2004 and tried to steal the second round of an election. And Ukrainians turned out in the streets and said they're not going to tolerate that. Ukraine is about the only country I can think of that within the space of a decade has seen two pro-democratic, pro-Western revolutions take place. And after the first one, Viktor Yushchenko became president. He turned out to have been a disappointment. Then Yanukovych did win in a free and fair election in 2010. He even passed legislation in 2010 that made Ukraine a non-aligned state. And here's where I'll pick up on the NATO issue. Ukraine from 2010 through most of 2014 was a non-aligned state, which meant that it was not pursuing membership in NATO. In 2008, while Yushchenko was still president before Yanukovych, Ukraine sought what was called a membership action plan from NATO. But instead of agreeing on that, NATO leaders, including President Bush at the time and Chancellor Merkel, agreed on language that said Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. Didn't say how, didn't say when. They didn't agree to offer Ukraine or Georgia a membership action plan, but they said both countries will become members. And ever since, Ukraine has been either seeking that membership or seeking neutrality. And it was under Yanukovych they sought neutrality. The importance of this is that in 2014, when Putin first invaded, NATO was not an issue. There was no one talking about Ukraine joining NATO. It was about the European Union, not NATO. So when you hear people arguing it's NATO enlargement that's responsible for this, I would argue that is not the case at all, because it certainly was not an issue when Putin decided to launch his first invasion of Ukraine. More recently, President Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, who won in the election in 2019, has made joining NATO a key part of his foreign policy. And he has not gotten very far. When he's raised this with President Biden has said Ukraine has a lot more work to do. During their visits to Kiev in the past week or two, President Macron and President Scholz were kind of pouring cold water on the idea, essentially saying, do you really want to risk a disastrous war over a goal that you're not going to be able to reach? Keep in mind, in order to join NATO, all members of NATO have to agree on extending an invitation. And as long as there's one holdout, and that holdout could be Germany, it could be France, it could be Hungary, by the way, whose prime minister is very pro-Russian and paid a visit to Moscow last week. Any country could essentially exercise a veto. For those who argue that we should close the door on NATO for Ukraine, I would argue that doing so would grant Mr. Putin a de facto veto over other countries' aspirations for joining. That would violate NATO's charter, Article 10, that keeps an open door policy for European countries that want to join. And it would be a betrayal, I think, to Ukraine. It's not to argue that we should bring Ukraine into NATO tomorrow, but I think NATO membership has been an extremely important incentive for countries that have joined to undertake necessary difficult reform. And I think that's true in the case of Ukraine as well. And so Ukrainians do want to join. Support for joining Ukraine, for joining NATO rather, among Ukrainians in 2014 was in the low teens in surveys that were conducted. There was not much support for joining NATO, and it wasn't really an issue. Not surprisingly, after Mr. Putin invaded Ukraine, support for joining NATO has shot up to more than 60%. And it's not a surprise that when Russian forces invade your country, you might want to seek the protection from Article 5 security guarantees that NATO provides for any future invasions. So the challenge that NATO faces is that parts of Ukraine are occupied, parts of Georgia are occupied as well, as I mentioned, and NATO is hesitant to take in a country that has contested territory. And also, there are some members who worry that offering Ukraine NATO membership would really provoke the Russians. Again, the problem with that, in my view, is that closing the door or arguing against NATO membership for Ukraine grants Mr. Putin a de facto veto over Ukraine's right to determine its own future. These are rights, by the way, that Russia pledged to abide by, including in the Helsinki Accords and the Paris Charter and other agreements that it has signed, including bilateral ones, the Friendship Treaty with Ukraine in 1997. So the NATO issue, I would argue, is a recent one for Putin. He's never liked NATO enlargement, although he had broached the idea of actually having Russia join NATO early on in his tenure, but on Russia's terms, not on the basis of meeting the criteria that NATO requires. And so there has been, I think, a bigger issue made of this than there should be. The bottom line, in my view, is that Mr. Putin does not want to see Ukraine succeed because he worries that that represents a threatening alternative model to what he runs in Russia. And so, yes, Zelensky has made a bigger deal of NATO in the past year, but Putin knows that NATO is in no position to offer membership right now. Zelensky, even in the past few days, has kind of walked back his talk about joining NATO. He's referred to it as a dream on Monday. There was even talk yesterday that the Ukrainians were thinking of holding a referendum. The challenge to all this is after the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, after Yanukovych fled to Russia, Ukraine amended its constitution, and as part of its constitution, it says joining NATO and the EU are foreign policy objectives of the country. And so that's why if you hear some debate about what's been said this week, including by Ukraine's ambassador in London, that's what's going on there. Let me wrap up by saying this has been a crisis fabricated by Mr. Putin. There is no Ukraine crisis. This is a Putin crisis, in my view. And I do emphasize Putin versus Russia. I think it's important to distinguish between the Putin regime in Moscow and Russia writ large. I think President Biden was right when he said the other day, the Russian people are not our enemy. I completely agree with that. I do think that the current regime in Moscow is an enemy. It's a threat. It's a danger to us. That has interfered in our elections, that has engaged in disinformation campaigns, has been responsible for cyber and ransomware attacks, including, by the way, on American hospitals in the middle of a deadly pandemic. Those aren't the acts of a friendly country toward us. But Putin is afraid of a successful democratic Ukraine, and that's why he's interested, I don't think, in taking over Ukraine. I don't think in restoring the Soviet Union, but I think in destabilizing his neighbors so that they do not pose a threatening alternative to what he oversees in Russia. So the next few days and weeks will be ones to pay very close attention. This is a very tense time right now. The Ukrainians have done, in my view, essentially nothing wrong, nothing to deserve yet another attack from Mr. Putin. But that's where they currently are, with so many Russian troops along the border threatening to cross over. If they did, the devastation, I think, would be heartbreaking, where some predictions say tens of thousands of people killed, millions of refugees. That would also increase instability in the rest of the European continent. And so this is why I hope I've made the case for why this issue is important, why we need to pay attention, why it is in our interest to take a strong stand against Mr. Putin. He only understands strength and pushback. And when faced with that, he has backed down. And the two examples I'll cite and end with are in 2015, November 2015, 2 months after Russia intervened in Syria, a Russian military jet violated Turkish airspace, and the Turks shot the plane down and killed 2 pilots. Mr. Putin didn't do anything about it. Turkey is a member of NATO. In 2018, when Russian mercenaries known as the Wagner Group started to move against American soldiers in Syria, we warned them to stop. They didn't, and American aircraft bombed them and killed probably some 200 to 300 Russian mercenaries. The Russians didn't make a big deal out of it. We didn't either, to be clear. But those are examples. I'm not arguing for going to war with Russia. Don't get me wrong. I think President Biden is right to say we are not going to send troops there, although I wish he wouldn't telegraph that to Mr. Putin. But I do think that when faced with strong pushback, Mr. Putin does back down, and I think that's the only way to deal with a bully. Sometimes you have to bloody his nose in order for him to get the message. So let me stop there, and I'd be happy to take any questions or listen to any criticism or comments, whatever you may have. Thank you.
David, thank you so much. That was an incredibly packed few minutes of history and situation setting for us, which I really appreciate. Please, members and guests, please feel free to put your questions in the chat for David. We have 2 and would love to have more. I have one to start with, just because I can't figure it out. Why now? What is it that triggered this timing? You talked about the beginning of troop movements in last April and this succession, but what is it that made this look like a good idea to Putin right now?
It's a great question, Claire. I think part of it is it comes in the aftermath of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, which I think Russian propaganda had a field day with. They viewed that as a sign of weakness, of disengagement by the United States, and thought that they might have more leeway to do what they want in their neighborhood. I think there's a line of argument that Putin thinks that time is not on his side, that he needs to move quickly in order to try to undermine Ukraine and its move toward the West. I think, frankly, that reflects a poor understanding and reading of his neighboring states. Ukraine still has a lot of challenges and problems of its own. Joining NATO is not in the cards anytime soon, nor is joining the European Union, for that matter, even though President Zelensky has made a strong push on both. And I think I'm not passing judgment on this, I think in Moscow there is a perception that they can take advantage of the Biden administration. If you look at what happened when they built up military forces last spring, instead of maintaining a tough line, the Biden administration offered Putin a summit in Geneva. And so Putin also doesn't like to be ignored. And I think increasingly he felt that he and Russia were being ignored as the Biden administration kept talking about China and climate and Iran. And Putin wanted to remind the world that he's over there too and can make a lot of noise and needs attention. So I think a whole range of factors go into this. And the last thing I'd add is the situation in Russia is not terribly good. And we've seen Mr. Putin use projection of power in other cases as a way to deflect attention from the domestic problems. We saw this in 2014 when he illegally annexed Crimea. That was very popular, and his ratings went up significantly. They didn't benefit all that much after he went into the Donbass, not soon after, because Russia kind of got bogged down there. The operation in Syria in 2015 was initially popular. It was muscle flexing on the Russian part, but again, that hasn't sustained itself. And we see Russia's economy stagnant almost for the past decade. The coronavirus pandemic has really hit Russia hard. and Putin has done nothing about it. And the last thing I'll say is in 2020, he amended the Constitution where he could conceivably stay in power until 2036. And I think that prospect for a lot of Russians doesn't sit too well. So Mr. Putin is trying to shake things up beyond Russia's borders when he's not really focused on the job at home.
Thank you. That was an incredible answer. Our first question from the audience comes from Austin Merkel.
Any relation?
You might know him.
Okay.
I think you met him the day he was born, if I recall correctly.
That is true.
Mr. Kramer, how significant of a role do you believe Russian disinformation has had in providing pretext for a potential invasion? And what can the United States and its allies do to lessen its real impact?
Yeah, it's a great question, Austin. I mean, Russian disinformation has played a primary role, not just in the past few months, but for a long time since Putin first invaded Ukraine in 2014. We've seen a steady disinformation campaign from Moscow targeted toward Ukraine. And it continues, and it continues in Russian language, it continues in Ukrainian language. Ukrainians have done something about this. They shut down some pro-Russian TV stations. I know some people will cry violation of freedom of speech, but when you're in a war, and Ukraine has been in a war with Russia since 2014, there are some measures that one might take if those stations are propagating Russian nonsense, frankly. I think the United States, as I mentioned, has done a very good job of putting out into the public domain a lot of the plots and scheming on the part of the Russians to try to preempt them, to expose them, to prepare the Ukrainian population and the broader European and American audience that if they see some of this stuff, they'll recognize it because the United States had already warned people this is what the Russians are up to. So it's an aggressive campaign. It's one that I think we've been doing a good job on and pushing back, but there's no let up in sight. And we just saw it today where the Russians were claiming that the Ukrainians fired a shell on this kindergarten or this nursery. And a lot of these things seem to be coming up now as providing a pretext for Mr. Putin to move in militarily should he decide to do so.
Next question is from Charlie Tishy. Thank you for sharing your ideas with us. Russian history has always treated Ukraine as a wayward younger brother. It seems that Putin feels Ukraine should bow to Russia's control, like not joining NATO. How can Western countries use this background to convince Russia to treat Ukraine as a respectable contemporary, established nation, thereby bringing peace?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And it reminds me, I should have mentioned that for years, Putin has not viewed Ukraine as a independent state. In 2008, when he met with President Bush on the margins of the Bucharest NATO summit, he said to President Bush, Ukraine is not a real state. He wrote a nearly 7,000 word screed against Ukraine last July, published on the Kremlin website, in which he said Russia and Ukraine are one people, and essentially arguing that Ukraine is, again, not a serious state. That, of course, does raise a bit of a problem for him. Why, if they're one people, would he attack one people? And so that does present a bit of a problem that could backfire on him. And but he has consistently questioned the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, arguing that Ukraine really is part of Russia. I think we have to remind him that Russia has signed up to numerous agreements and treaties and charters that reflect that the breakup of the Soviet Union led to 15 independent states, and each state is supposed to recognize the independence and sovereignty of the other. Russia has signed bilateral agreements with Ukraine that would reflect that Russia views Ukraine as an independent, separate state. So Putin is trying to undermine all of these agreements from the past and argue that, in fact, no, Ukraine is not a real independent state. Ukraine is a true independent state. Just ask Ukrainians about that. You may have seen the pictures from Ukraine yesterday after President Zelensky on 2 days' notice declared it the Day of Unity. And thousands of people turned out in cities and towns across the country in a display of true patriotism. And so I think Ukrainians have shown that they are an independent state. They have some challenges and problems. A lot of countries do, but they are a true independent state, and they do not want to be under the thumb of Moscow. They want to orient themselves more to the Euro-Atlantic community, and that is a right they have under the Helsinki Accords, under the Paris Charter, the European Security Charter in 1999, as well as some bilateral agreements. So we have to keep reminding people of that.
Let's turn to the economy. We have a couple of questions from Neil Kochenauer and Gregory Faith. What is the long-term outlook for the Russian economy? And it seems that if it's almost a mono economy, Putin must see how China has expanded its economy by opening up. The Russian GDP per capita is very low. Is it producing anything that is in demand in the world market? And then the counter question to that is, can you comment on the potential damage to the US economy that would follow a Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Yeah, both very good questions. So the Russian economy really took a hit in 2013-14, more from the drop in the price of oil, because Russia's economy is heavily dependent on the energy sector for exports and revenue generation. And the economy has not really bounced back. And the sanctions, of course, added to Russia's economic woes. The IMF and World Bank estimate that it could have affected GDP on the order of 1.5% to 2%. And Russia has also, however, built up some $630 to $650 billion in foreign currency reserves. And that is viewed as a sign of strength for the Russian economy, but the Russian economy is not doing well. That's the bottom line. The standard of living has not improved in nearly a decade, and Russia has tried to become more autarkic, particularly after sanctions imposed by the West, but it hasn't been terribly successful in doing so. If it moves in to Ukraine and we respond with massive sanctions, that would have, I think, a pretty significant impact on Russia's economy. That would make life for a lot of average Russians, there's no denying it, more difficult. But it would also make for more pressure on the Russian leadership to possibly change its position and approach to dealing with Ukraine, in order to alleviate the pressure from the sanctions. So there is a lot riding on this. And I think history will look back on Putin's failure over the 2+ decades he's been president to diversify Russia's economy away from development of natural resources and reliance on that for export earnings. Russia, has natural resources that people want. Its other main sector that people want is in the arms trade, where Russia is a leading seller of military equipment. Yeah, there aren't a lot of Russian clothes and other things that they produce. And a lot of the best and brightest are leaving. And I think this too will be something that people will reflect on, of a huge failure on the part of Putin. Putin is deliberately driving out the more liberal-minded, any opposition, any independent voices. A lot of Russians have fled the country, and a lot of the 18 to 32, 34-year-old age range don't see a bright future in Russia. The impact on us, there certainly will be more on Europe than on the United States. It's possible Russia would again cut off gas, and that's why the United States has been ramping up its exports of liquefied natural gas to Europe, and in fact has reached a point where we're providing more of that to Europe than Russia is providing gas, and that's a positive thing. But so Europe would certainly take a hit just because there's more trade between Europe and Russia. But we would see an increase in the price of gas. I think there's no question, not something any of us want to see, given the gas prices are already quite high. It could lead to some supply disruptions. We also could see more cyber attacks. Keep in mind, we've already been the target of a cyber attack that took down briefly the Colonial Pipeline, a cyber attack that affected the largest meat processing facility in the United States. And as I mentioned, we've had ransomware attacks against American hospitals and medical facilities in the middle of a deadly pandemic. So Russia likely will respond should we be forced to impose sanctions as a result of an invasion, and life undoubtedly will get more difficult. So that's why it's important to try to preempt this from before we're in an even worse situation.
Thank you. A question from Susan Schultz. What is the status and potential impact of Russia's apparently improved relationship with China? Also, how would we deter the opening of the pipeline? And I would just add to that, you had mentioned that in the sanctions package that Nord Stream 2 was potentially possibly going to go away from that perspective. But do we have the power to do that, or do we have to rely on Germany? So big question.
So on the second part, Claire, it would obviously be much better if the Germans put a stop to this. But President Biden has made clear that if they don't, we will, and we will sanction the entities responsible for Nord Stream 2, and Germany will realize they would rather be in good standing with the United States than in violation and subject to sanctions. So it's not ideal. It's why the administration issued the waivers last May, but we will go ahead and stop the pipeline from becoming certified and operational if need be, if the Germans don't do it themselves. And I hope the Germans would. Chancellor Scholz was a little cagey on this earlier in the week, or last week rather, when he was in Washington meeting with President Biden. But we will. The Russia-China relationship is a complicated one. I know there's a lot been made of President Putin's attendance at the opening ceremonies of the Olympics in Beijing, almost 2 weeks ago, and this very long statement that was issued in which the friendship has no limits. It's a complicated relationship. And China is a rising power, which is a separate source of concern. China, by the way, is watching how we respond should Russia move in against Ukraine. That could have an impact on China's calculations toward Taiwan. But China, I think, also recognizes that the relationship with the United States is more important to Beijing than the relationship with Russia. It is, I sort of call it not even a marriage of convenience, it's almost dating by convenience between Russia and China. There were skirmishes along the Russian-Chinese border in 1969. There's been a long history of distrust between the two. And I think even in Moscow, there is growing uneasiness about Russia's dependence on the relationship with China, and concern also about the sales of military equipment to China that they worry could be used one day against them.
I think we have time for one more question, and it regards nuclear power plants. Ukraine has many nuclear power plants. If there were a Russian invasion, what is the risk to those plants of a nuclear accident?
Yeah, it can't be ruled out. And you know, one of the paths from the Belarus side to, if they were to go to the capital of Kyiv, one could take a path through the Chernobyl zone. People have been able to go through there, so it would be a mistake to think that it is radioactive and the Russians would avoid it because their troops would become sick or deathly ill from it. But Ukraine does rely on nuclear power to a considerable extent, and that could be a target for Putin and his forces to try to disable that, particularly if they tried to bring down the pipeline that runs through Ukraine. Ukraine does have work to do to try to modernize its economy and implement major reform. This crisis has had a huge negative impact on Ukraine, particularly the American and Western talk. Again, I'm not saying it's unfounded, but the American and Western talk about an imminent invasion that has scared off foreign investors who are already having a tough time given the level of corruption in Ukraine. And so this has been, I think, a case where Ukraine has been trying to do the right thing. It has not done anything to deserve what Mr. Putin is doing to it. And it is paying a serious economic price at a minimum as a result of these growing tensions. But Ukrainians are holding firm, and they are prepared to fight if they have to. They're not asking us to fight for them. They are asking us to provide the military means so that they can defend themselves. And we have done so in the case of helping them build up their cyber defenses. I don't know if we've done anything in the way of helping them protect their nuclear power and reactors. But if Russia were to do that, then we all could have a much bigger problem on our hands.
I think we have come to the end of our time, and I apologize to those whose questions I did not get to, but I'd like to thank you, David, for being with us today and sharing just an incredible amount of information and thoughts with us. As always, cogent, thoughtful, clear, and incredibly easy to grasp of a very, very tough situation and a timely one. So our gratitude to you from all of PCFR, and we hope you will join us again, no matter how this goes.
Hopefully in person next time.
In person, you are welcome anytime. And for our
Thank
members joining us, thank you for being here today. We appreciate your participation, and please do watch the website for upcoming programs and join us for the next one. Thank you and have a great day, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, David.